In July, I challenged myself to focus my attention on reading one massive book. And that is just what I did. I told myself if I managed to read anything else, it would be a bonus. And, well, honestly, that massive book kind of destroyed me a little bit. So I'm glad that I found time to read a few more books as well. Because that massive book, as I've mentioned in more than one video this month, was rough. It was a difficult but ultimately worthwhile experience. It gave me a lot to think about, and I expressed that in several different videos. And I'm not exactly burying the lead as to what that book was because, well, it's behind me. That colossal book was The Stand by Stephen King, a book I had never read before. Now, I am a Stephen King fan, and I talked about what I think makes him so special in a video this month that you can go and watch. But The Stand is not a pleasant or easy reading experience. And I talked about that as well in a different video. Reading an enormous book like this really took it out of me. But the reason that I was able to get through it faster than I thought is because I took a very long trip down to London and back. I drove myself all the way there and all the way back, which is a 15-hour round trip from Glasgow, where I live. And on that trip, I listened to the audiobook at like 1.5 times speed. So I got through like half the book just on the drive. So that was good. Even though I struggle a lot with audiobooks, and I think I'm going to talk about that in an upcoming video as well. For those who haven't read it, The Stand is an enormous post-apocalyptic, or rather, I guess, apocalyptic story. Stephen King has said that this was his attempt at writing a great Lord of the Rings style epic. And it is a clash of good versus evil, although that isn't really apparent for quite a while, like at least half of the book. For so much of it, it is just about the decline and the crumbling of civilization as a horrible pandemic grips all of American society. We follow a diverse group of characters, and we move from chapter to chapter, character to character, all around the country. We go from state to state and we get to know these people slowly. At the beginning, they're just living their ordinary lives, and each of their lives is very different. But soon, well, within a matter of weeks, and we slowly read through those weeks, the pandemic kills off 99% of North Americans, and the world turns into a very different place. This was a pretty early book in Stephen King's canon, and it's incredible what he managed to do at such a young age and so early in his career. But if you've been reading King for a long time, that won't take you by surprise. He's done really amazing things with his career. But I personally found The Stand incredibly uncomfortable as someone who is riddled with anxiety and plagued by OCD demons. This very uncomfortable book gave me panic attacks and nightmares. By the time I got to the second half, I dreaded picking it up for another session. I didn't want to read it anymore. But I got through it. And I talked about that in a separate video where I didn't even mention this book, a video all about DNFing books or not finishing books and the ramifications of that and if it's good or if it's bad. And it's amazing how the comments on that video are split 50-50 between people who very confidently say they never DNF a book and people who very confidently say life's too short, just put it down if you don't like it. And that's why it was interesting, and I looked at both sides, etc., etc. This book really took it out of me, and I didn't want to finish it. But I was also reading it at a time when I had just gone back on SSRIs. If you don't know, SSRIs are a medication for anxiety and depression, typically called antidepressants, but I'm not depressed, I have anxiety. I was on them for a while a few years ago, and I realized that my mental health had declined to the point that I had to go back on them. For the first few weeks, SSRIs are not a pleasant experience. Your anxiety heightens, and you get other symptoms as well, like blurry vision and bad stomach stuff. It's very unpleasant. And I read this book during that time. Now, quite frankly, I feel amazing. And I think I probably would handle this book a lot better now, even just 2 weeks after finishing it. But that's not what happened. I chose to read it at the worst possible moment, and that made for an interesting reading experience. The Stand is difficult, but it was worth it. I'm really glad that I read it. I do love Stephen King, and again, I explained why in its own dedicated video that you can go watch. The Stand is rough. but it's worth it. But because of how rough the stand is, I really needed a good palette cleanser. After finishing it, I wanted something fun, something bright and vibrant, something fantastical with a kind of fairy tale vibe. And so I ended up picking up one of the good romantic fantasy books, Paladin's Grace by T. Kingfisher. If you're a fan of this channel, you'll probably know that T. Kingfisher is one of my favorite authors. What makes her so special is that she is as deft at writing dark fantasy inspired by fairy tales as she is at writing really bleak, often family-orientated American Southern Gothic horror. It's amazing how she juggles both of these genres, and it kind of demonstrates how there is a weird overlap between them, the darkness of fairy tales and the darkness of Southern Gothic. If you read something like The Twisted Ones, or her kind of adaptation remake thing of Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, then you see how there is a fairy tale nature to these Southern Gothic books. But Paladin's Grace is something else entirely. There are a few creepy elements to this book, but they're few and far between. For the most part, this is a clever and original fantasy with a very charming romance interstitched into it. Well, it's not really stitched, it's kind of the main through line. But you can see it here in this charming as all hell cover. This is so beautiful. Now, Paladin's Grace originally came out in 2020 in the US, and there are 3 sequels. But here in the UK, we only just got all 4 of these books. They all came out on the same day back in April. I have now read the first one, and I'm going to read the other 3 soon, because what a charming and lovely story this is. It tells the story of a paladin named Stephen, and a woman named Grace who makes perfume. The book, in the most gripping way possible, opens with Stephen's god that he worships and serves as a paladin dying. He suddenly gets this kind of feeling that washes through him that his god is dead. And the death of his god is vital to the story and him as a character, but it's not the main focus. Because after that, we jump forward and we see that Stephen and the other paladins of this dead god have moved. They've been taken in by a different religion, a different group. And a frightening thing about these paladins is they have the potential to kind of rage. Like in D&D. If you play D&D, you know what a rage is. They go into this feral, bloodthirsty, angry rage. Stephen is terrified of losing control and this happening to him. And early in the book, he meets Grace. And from here, the story is one of romance, but also mystery. It's a story of assassinations and detangling political webs. It's not complicated, it's delightfully simple, but T. Kingfisher's world building is so solid that you really get lost in this city and the experiences of its people, and especially the romance that blossoms between these 2 characters. Paladin's Grace was a wonderful, wonderful palette cleanser after reading The Stand, and it got me back into fantasy, so let's keep going. I fell into a fresh fantasy mood at just the right time because this handsome fella just came along. Look at this cover. It's incredible. And I got the spreadges as well. Do people say spreadges? I think I've heard spreadges. Well, I just said it. But I'm not taking credit. I'm sure people say. Anyway, this is the debut novel by American writer Ryan Rose, 7 Recipes for Revolution. And this is, I think I could pretty confidently say, a novel massively inspired by anime. Because this is just what you would get if you combined Delicious in Dungeon with Attack on Titan, but give it actually good politics and morals. Attack on Titan's horrible. 7 Recipes for Revolution has a kind of goofiness to it as well that I really appreciate. It's very overtly political about working class people, or more like indentured slaves, fighting to free themselves from an oppressive regime. But there is a goofiness to it in that the magic system, the world building, the politics, the religion, everything in this book, in this world, is about food. People name their children after different spices. And it is leaned into, this goofiness, I think. It's kind of like how in the Horizon video games, characters are often named after something to do with metal. You know, like the main character is called Aloy, like alloy, and the guy who raised her is called Rost, like rust. Those games are so janky and weird. Not in the mechanics, but like in their writing. It's very janky. This one, it's similar, but it's fun. The magic system is all about cooking meals out of the meat of precious magic monster animals. So I guess it's also kind of like the Monster Hunter video games. There's a lot of video game and anime DNA in here, but the politics kind of remind me of something like the Hunger Games, but without the Hunger Games element. It's about revolution, it's in the title. And it's also delightfully queer. Our protagonist is raised by two women, and there's a big emphasis on pronouns as well. Characters will introduce themselves and their pronouns, but instead of it being sort of ham-fisted in, it's part of the traditional dialogue, the traditional greetings that people often share with each other. So again, it's kind of goofy, but in a really charming way. There's a lot to love about this book, and I'm going to go over it in a lot more detail in an upcoming video. I was so pleasantly surprised by the fact that it's all about food. It's very inspired by anime and video games. It's very politically overt. It is, after all, about a working class revolution. But it's also campy and goofy and fun. I'll talk about it more soon. Look out for that video. And finally, before I get into the comic book section of the video, the last novel that I read this month is The Tainted Cup. This is a novel by Robert Jackson Bennett, and this, along with some of the other fantasy books I've read recently, has given me an idea for a topic that I really want to explore. The Tainted Cup is my first book by this author. Apparently he's written quite a few others, but this is the only one I've ever seen. And I know it has a sequel that I think has just come out in hardcover as well. The Tainted Cup is a 400-page blend of fantasy and murder mystery. And it took me back to something that I remember Brandon Sanderson saying in a lecture that I watched on YouTube. In that lecture, Sanderson mentioned that you can make your protagonist anyone. A protagonist in a fantasy story could, for example, be a journalist. And that has always stuck in my head. I'd love to write a fantasy novel where the protagonist is a journalist, not a hero, not a princess, not a warrior, not a wizard, a journalist. It's a really fun idea. And this is, in effect, a Sherlock Holmes story in a fantasy world. But what's amazing about it is because it's in a fantasy world, Robert Jackson Bennett still has the task of creating world building, of doing world building through a murder mystery story. Agatha Christie didn't need to do any world building. Her books are just set in the world. But here we have an entirely fresh world that has gods and monsters and a magic system and politics and geography and history and everything that goes into creating an entirely fresh new world. And it does so through a murder investigation. That's really wild. It's a big ask, and it's not a particularly long book. 400 pages, pretty reasonable. And it's very much written in a Sherlock Holmes style because our first-person narrator protagonist is the sidekick of an established investigator, and that investigator is a very arrogant woman. She's very rude, she's very unpersonable, she's not nice to be around, and that makes her pretty funny, but in a way that only we would enjoy from the outside. If you ever met her, you'd want to slap her. And our protagonist is her protege, a young soldier who has been told to be her apprentice. He's been assigned to her, and he doesn't enjoy it. When the book begins, he goes to a mansion to investigate a very strange death, where a tree has sprouted out of a man. He died by being ripped open by this tree that has now grown in a room in this big house. It's weird as hell. And from there, a political web becomes untangled. There is so much more to this. The implications of this death spiral out into the world at large, and that's how the world building gets done. And it's fantastic as well. This is a lot of fun. I really enjoy how fantasy is just doing weird things at the moment. A crossover between the genres of fantasy and crime thriller. That's original, and it's really, really cool. It's so well done. Now, another thing that has kind of helped me recover from reading The Stand was James Gunn's Superman film, which, at the time that this video goes up, I will have seen 3 times at the cinema. And James Gunn's Superman is everything I hoped it would be, honestly. When I came out of the cinema the first time, I didn't even feel that impressed because I had a very clear idea of what James Gunn's Superman would look like, what the film would accomplish, the tone of it, the sense of humor, even the way that the combat and the action scenes would all be directed. And so everything that I saw play out in that film, I just kind of went, yep, there it is, there's that, there's that. Here's how I thought he'd handle the romance. Here's how I thought the action scenes would play out. Here's the gorgeous costuming. Here's the lovely set design. Here's this, here's that. Here's the humor. Here's the impact. Here's the politics, blah, blah, blah. I was just kind of ticking off everything I knew would be there. Because one, I'm a huge, massive Superman fan. He's my favorite superhero in the whole world. And two, I'm a big fan of James Gunn, and I knew what he would bring to Superman. So I kind of just went, yep, there it all is, great. And then of course, I just kept going back for more. James Gunn's Superman is everything I ever wanted out of a Superman story. It is now the definitive Superman story for me, and it's also the definitive superhero movie. It is my favorite superhero film, beating out Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2. Which I never thought would happen. It is perfect, it is wonderful. And as a comic book collector, I was thrilled because comics make me happy. So let's talk about some comics. Transformers is something that I didn't grow up on, and I've noticed something curious. I'm not someone who talks about generations a lot, you know, boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, blah, blah, blah. But I am a millennial, which means that as a kid, I was kind of too young for the Transformers cartoon. That was very much an 80s thing for Gen X kids. So I completely missed it. My thing was Power Rangers and the X-Men cartoon from the 90s. That was the stuff I loved as a kid. And then Pokemon came along and blah, blah, blah. Got big into anime, Dragon Ball Z, etc. Transformers passed me by. But a kind of curious thing is, since moving to Scotland, most of the friends that I've made here in Glasgow are quite a few years younger than me, people in their 20s. I'm 35 now, and I've got friends who are 25, 26, 27. And a lot of these friends are big into Transformers. Transformers is big, apparently, for people in their 20s, which is really fun. So my friend Cam told me to read the new Transformers comic. A few months ago, I read the first volume, and this is the second volume. Both were written by Daniel Warren Johnson, but he drew volume 1, the first 6 issues of the comic, and he has not drawn volume 2. Almost dropped it then. You're fine. The art for this one was drawn by Jorge Corona, but Mike Spicer is doing the colouring just like before, so it's got that same colour palette. And the art feels very similar to what Johnson did in volume 1. And I've already heard that I think starting with volume 4, so like issue 19, I guess, Robert Kirkman is taking over writing and Dan Mora is doing the art. I love Dan Mora's art. He's been drawing Superman for a while and oh god, he's wonderful. So that is one hell of a team. But this is great. This is fantastic. This is the first Transformers thing outside of those god-awful Michael Bay movies. This is the first Transformers thing I've ever really enjoyed. And that's really cool. It's also pretty gnarly. Like, a lot of people die in this. Like, Transformers die quickly. And I'm like, hang on, I know your name. You're a big character. Oh, you're dead. Okay. Oh my god. So it's kind of shocking. It's brutal. And really fun. The art is dynamic and cinematic and gorgeous. And then, of course, we have Superman. I've been reading a lot of Superman comics recently, partly because I was excited for Gunn's film, but also because I love Superman. I read his comics a lot. And very recently, over the last 5 years, we've had so many good Superman stories. If you don't read Superman comics, one thing that you might be interested in learning is that there are always 2 on the go. Sometimes more. There's The Brave and the Bold and World's Finest and other stuff. You don't need to worry about that. There are always 2 Superman comics that come out every single month. One is called Superman. And historically, that has kind of been the second one, with the main, more important one, with the bigger artist and writer names attached, is Action Comics. Because Action Comics is where Superman first appeared nearly 100 years ago. So Action Comics is one of the big DC titles. Although I would say recently they've kind of switched those 2 things over a little bit. Have they? I don't know. Basically, the recent run on Superman has been written by Joshua Williamson, who's a huge name in comics, and it's been such a good run. And up until recently, Action Comics was being written by Philip Kennedy Johnson, who is amazing at writing cosmic stuff, body horror stuff. He wrote an Alien comic recently, as in Ridley Scott's Alien. He wrote the Hulk recently and turned the Hulk into a real body horror thing. He's great. And he's so good at writing things that feel pulpy. His Action Comics is pulp sci-fi. This is like Silver Age Superman stuff. Superman goes to Warworld and he loses access to the Yellow Sun and he has to wield a sword and fight as a gladiator on Warworld. It's really badass and really fun. But Philip Kennedy Johnson never forgets the fact that Superman is always Superman. And so even though he's handed a sword, they call him the Bladeless One, or something like that. The guy who just refuses to swing his sword. So he's still Superman. He's put in this cosmic gladiator arena on a planet with no sympathy, no kindness, no goodness. And he's still the good person because he's Superman. This is pulp sci-fi. And if you want to see Superman in pulp sci-fi, this is it. And to be honest, like half of the Superman stories out there are surprisingly pulpy sci-fi. This is great fun. And finally, as I hold this comic up, I realize I actually talked about it at the end of last month because I read it right on the cusp between the months and I don't think I'd actually finished it when I talked about it last month. Anyway, I'm gonna mention it again because Superman. Superman is just everything that's in my head right now. This is Superman Space Age. It was drawn by Mike and Laura Allred, who are a married couple who do the drawing and coloring of comics respectively. They work together a lot and they're an amazing power couple. And it was written by Mark Russell. This is an original and unique Superman story set during the Space Age. It takes place between the 1960s and 1980s, and so we get a Superman of that era. The book also introduces lots of other characters, including Batman and some of his rogues gallery. It's a book that also kind of rewrites the lead up to Crisis on Infinite Earths. If you don't know what that is, Crisis on Infinite Earths was a comic that came out in, I think, 1985, 86, and it was the first big event comic in DC's history. It rewrote and reestablished an entirely new status quo for the DC universe. There's a guy called the Pariah who is cursed with traveling from universe to universe, reality to reality, as each of those realities is swallowed up by a creature called the Anti-Monitor. No, it doesn't matter what the Anti-Monitor is or why he's called that. You don't need to know. But the Pariah just goes from place to place and has to witness a universe being destroyed over and over again across infinite universes. And he arrives at this one and he tells Clark Kent in a newspaper interview that they have like 20 years left. And for that 20 years, we watch Superman be Superman. It's a very, very political book. So if you enjoyed the overt politics of James Gunn's Superman and the very obvious geopolitical allegories of that film, well, you're going to enjoy this one for the exact same reason. The story of Clark and Lois here is fantastic. The story of Batman and what he does with his wealth and his power. The story of what kind of Superman Clark chooses to be. It is perfect for fans of Gunn's film. In fact, that's my recommendation. If you watched James Gunn's Superman and you loved it and you want to read some Superman comics, read this and Grant Morrison's All-Star Superman. Start with those two. This is a fresh and unique and beautiful story. There you go. That is everything that I read in July. August is it's going to be different, but I'll talk about that in the next video. If you enjoyed this one, you can support me on Patreon. My Patreon supporters are the reason that this channel exists, and I have so much fun every single day in my Discord community, just chatting about books and life and queer joy and so many other lovely things. So for $1 a month, you can join my Discord and you get a few other benefits, and there's $3 and $5 and $10 tiers, all with different bonuses and benefits. And you'd just be helping keep the lights on this channel, and I would really, really appreciate that. So if you can support me on Patreon, I'd massively, massively appreciate it. And of course, you can also buy a copy of my book in the description. This is Managing and Other Lies. It is a queer horror short story collection. that I'm very, very proud of, and I am working on more stories that I am publishing in my Patreon as they are finished. They're slow going because writing is slow, but there is new stuff. It's coming, it's happening. Stay tuned for more. In the meantime, if you haven't bought and read this, well, there are links in the description. Thank you. Subscribe for books.